Newborn movements have been classified into two general categories: reflex and spontaneous movements. Although both types of movements are present at the same time in the infant's life, they are very different from each other. Let's understand better how researchers define and differentiate reflexes from spontaneous movements. Reflexes are overt, stereotyped movements made in response to a specific stimulus. For example, the fetal startle response or eye shielding. Spontaneous are behaviors that have no clearly identifiable stimuli. For example, kicking and arm bending. There are three main reasons why these phylogenetic movements exist. The first one is because the baby needs to overcome the birth trauma. Second, reflexes and spontaneous movements facilitate survival. And finally, these both types of movements provide basis for later voluntary actions. Reflexes and spontaneous motor actions are considered to be rudimentary patterns of movement coordination and the early opportunities that we have in life to integrate sensory motor information. Reflexive movements, on the other hand, are considered indispensable in young infants' life. Unlike random movements, reflexes are involuntary movements that the individual makes in response to specific stimuli. Sometimes, these responses occur only when the body is in a specific position. An infant does not have to think about making reflexive movements. Reflexes occur automatically. In fact, reflexes are involuntary, coordinated muscular action, very sensitive to stimulus properties, and finally sensitive to physical contact such as posture and arousal state. Again, reflexes not just facilitate survival but also open a dialogue with the environment, providing what we consider to be rudimentary patterns of coordination, also known as coordinative structures. Keep in mind that some reflexes such as eye blinking occur throughout the lifespan, but others are present only during infancy, for example, infantile reflexes. We can categorize those seen during infancy into three different types of movements: primitive reflexes, postural reactions, and locomotor reflexes. We will define each of these categories and then discuss their purpose. However, reflexes represent only a small portion of early motor behavior. If not eating or sleeping, newborns most likely will squirm, move their legs or arms, stretch their fingers and toes, or make other spontaneous movements. Spontaneous actions have the function of facilitate exploration of relationships between muscle activation, body motion, and sensory feedback. In addition, they may provide basis for trial and error learning, which we call motor babbling. They are ways to communicate the state of the neonate with his or her caretakers. When a newborn infant grasps an object placed in her hand, she does automatically without conscious thought. If you put your finger on their mouth, you will perceive that the baby will start sucking your finger right away. And believe, the first times that this happens, it is an involuntary action. These are examples of primitive reflexes, an involuntary response to a specific stimulation. Lower brain centers often mediate these primitive reflexes. Generally, newborns exhibit strong reflexes at birth. These tend to lose their strength until they become voluntary actions. There is a list of primitive reflexes such as rooting, sucking, moro, and grasping. Another category of reflexes is the postural reactions that generally appears after the infant is 2 months old. For example, an infant can roll over only after the rotative riding reflex appears, around 4 months of age. By late in the first year or early in the second year of life, these isolated reactions recurring in specific postures and stimuli seem to drop out to infants' repertoire of movements. However, these reflexes don't literally disappear. Children and adults react to being thrown off balance with a specific muscle response intended to bring the body back to balance. If you have recently tried inline skating or snowboarding for the first time in your life, you probably know this. As you start to fall, you automatically extend your arms, and this automatic response results in many broken wrists and unbroken skull. Finally, Let's talk about those reflexes classified as locomotor. These reflexes are considered as such because they mimic later voluntary human behaviors that result in motion through the environment. For a while, in 1980s, infant swimming classes were all the rage. In these classes, parents placed their newborns in the water and the infants could actually swim. Precocious newborns? Perhaps, but more likely the infants were exhibiting the swimming reflexes. The swim reflex, like other locomotor reflex, get its name because it appears similar and related to a voluntary movement, which is swimming. The locomotor reflexes appear much earlier than the corresponding voluntary behaviors and typically disappear months before the infant attempts the voluntary locomotor skill. There are 3 such locomotor reflexes: stepping, swimming, and crawling. So let's review here. How exactly can you differentiate primitive reflexes from spontaneous movements? Again, reflexes are response to specific external stimuli, whereas spontaneous movements do not result from any apparent external stimuli. Reflex movements are specific and often localized, whereas spontaneous movements tend to be non-specific and generalized. The same stimulus will elicit a specific reflexes over and over again. Pediatricians, parents, and others believe that these movements were without any particular purpose or had no relationship to the future movements the child will someday choose to make. These spontaneous movements seem very different from walking or reaching. However, this may not be the case. All reflexes and spontaneous actions are, in fact, the base of what we call coordinative structures. Coordinative structures is the unit of action, is the level on which a behavior is learned or developed. It is the answer to the question raised by many researchers, that is, what exactly do we learn? Technically, a coordinative structure is a constrained behavior that is defined by synergistic action of muscles and joints that may be but are not necessarily physically connected to one another. Reflexes and spontaneous movements form the first behaviors in our motor repertoire. They are the structure of our voluntary, coordinated, and controlled movements.